Imagine standing at the absolute frozen limit of the Earth.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. It's April 1909. The temperature is so impossibly low that exposed skin literally freezes in seconds.
Just brutal.
And the ice beneath your feet is shifting. It's cracking, like threatening to open up and just swallow you whole.
Terrifying.
Totally. And you are 45 minutes ahead of the man who will ultimately take, all the historical credit for this expedition.
Right, all the glory.
Exactly. And yet, in this exact moment, you know that his survival, your survival, and the survival of the entire team depends almost entirely on you.
Your specific abilities.
Yeah, your specific ability to read the ice, repair the sledges, and actually speak the language of the Inuit people who are guiding you.
It's just a massive amount of pressure.
Unbelievable pressure. You are completely alone at the edge of the world doing the invisible work that history will, eventually build its foundations on.
It really is a terrifying and profound place to start. I mean, we often look back at history, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we see the massive established institutions.
For the finished product.
Exactly. The laws, the universities, the huge global movements. But we completely miss that chilling isolation that had to happen first.
We just skip right over it.
We do. We forget the solitary individuals who had to step into the absolute extremes, both literal and metaphorical, to just crack the ice.
Well, and that transition, right, from the solitary person freezing at the edge of the world to the eventual, iron-clad, unshakable institution, that is exactly what we are getting into today.
It's quite a journey.
It really is. So welcome to the deep dive. I am looking right at you, our listener.
Yes, yeah.
The one who is constantly trying to make sense of the complex machinery of history without feeling completely overwhelmed by, a million random dates.
Disconnected facts.
Yeah, and dry textbooks. We have a truly custom-tailored journey for you today.
We really do.
We are looking at a highly specific, honestly, completely fascinating stack of historical archives, daily logs, and research notes that have been curated just for this conversation.
And it is a remarkable collection of sources. I mean, what we've been handed here is a daily log of historical anchors.
Right, these specific events.
Exactly, specific events spanning a single calendar week from April 5th to April 11th across multiple centuries.
Which is such a cool way to look at it.
It is. But accompanying these logs is this master synthesis document that really gives us our mission today. Its title is The Architect's Blueprint, Forging the Sovereign Institution.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that title, The Architect's Blueprint, it tells us something important.
What's that?
That history isn't just a series of random, disconnected things that happen to happen.
Right, it's intentional.
Exactly. It is an interconnected chain of cause and effect. So the mission of today's deep dive is to trace a very deliberate historical arc across the global Black diaspora.
To the massive scope.
It is. We are going to examine how you move from what the sources call individual excellence and martyrdom all the way to the forging of institutional power.
And my goal today, is to help us draw those structural lines.
Yes, please.
We're going to connect these solitary pioneers, these individuals operating in incredibly hostile, isolated environments.
Like the North Pole.
Like the North Pole.
Yeah.
We're connecting them to the massive sovereign institutions that literally dictate the terms of our modern world today.
So cool.
We are looking at the exact mechanics of how a physical extreme transitions into a spiritual, legal, or economic stronghold.
Exactly. Because before you can build an institution, someone has to be the very first to break through.
Someone has to take that first step.
Right. Which brings us back to that frozen ice cap we started with. April 6, 1909, Matthew Henson.
Matthew Henson. He is the perfect embodiment of this first breakthrough concept. He is an African-American explorer and, frankly, a master navigator.
Absolute.
And on this specific day in 1909, he reached the geographic North Pole. But the sources emphasize a very crucial detail that, honestly, changes the standard historical narrative.
Oh, it totally flips it.
He reached it 45 minutes ahead of Robert Peary.
He was literally the first person there.
He was.
But when I read through these notes, what really struck me wasn't just the flag planting aspect. It was the functional reality of his presence.
What do you mean by that?
Well, the documents point out that Henson was the primary translator for the Inuit people, and he was the technical specialist of the entire expedition.
Yes.
So explain the mechanics of that to us. Why does that matter so much more than just, being the guy who got there first?
Well, because in an environment, that hostile survival is not about glory. It is about extremely complex systems management.
Systems management. Okay.
Right. The Arctic is not a static environment. It is a dynamic, violently shifting landscape.
Trying to kill you constantly.
Exactly. You have to understand sledge physics, dog behavior, ice fractures, and weather patterns.
Yeah.
Peary was the commander, sure, but Henson was the linguistic and technical linchpin.
The guy actually making it work.
Right. He learned the Inuit language, Inuktitut, which allowed him to bridge the gap between the Western explorers and the indigenous experts.
Without that, they're doomed.
Oh, completely.
Yeah.
Without that specific communication bridge, the expedition freezes to death, period. Henson was the one managing the physical apparatus of survival.
I keep picturing this like a modern aerospace mission.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. If you think about a crewed mission to Mars, Matthew Henson is essentially the lead systems engineer.
Yes.
He's the one doing the complex, life-saving technical work in the background in the most unforgiving vacuum known to humanity.
While someone else is designated to step out and give the famous speech for the cameras.
Exactly.
That analogy is highly accurate, actually. And it aligns perfectly with how our master synthesis document frames him.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The archives explicitly link Henson's physical and intellectual endurance to the future of scientific exploration.
What?
The document argues that his feat predates and sets the stage for modern aerospace pioneers.
That is wild.
Right. He is the direct conceptual ancestor of the astronauts and aeronautical engineers who would later break the atmosphere.
That makes total sense.
He proved that the human intellect could manage the absolute physical extremes of the planet, which is, the prerequisite for managing the extremes of space.
Man, Henson survived by reading the ice and navigating the physical extremes of the Arctic. But looking at our timeline, exactly 40 years earlier, another pioneer had to survive a completely different kind of freeze.
A political freeze.
A political freeze, yeah. How do you navigate a hostile environment when the icebergs are replaced by deeply entrenched, angry politicians?
Very carefully.
Right. That takes us to April 6th, 1869, Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett.
Bassett is a towering figure in the context of institutional firsts. He was the former principal of the Institute for Colored Youth.
So a brilliant academic.
A brilliant academic. And on this day, in 1869, he was appointed minister resident to Haiti by President Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, that specific appointment made him the very first black diplomat to represent the United States government.
I really want you, our listener, to pause and just think about the year for a second.
It's important.
It's 1869. The American Civil War had just ended a mere 4 years prior.
Just 4 years.
The country had literally just torn itself to pieces, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of its own citizens over the enslavement and the fundamental humanity of black people.
Exactly.
The dust from the battlefield hasn't even settled, the blood is barely dry, and now Bassett is stepping into a diplomatic parlor to represent that very same federal government on the global stage.
It's a lot to process.
The psychological whiplash of that is staggering.
It is almost unimaginable, and the geopolitical tightrope he had to walk was just as perilous.
I bet.
He is navigating the extremely complex waters of the Caribbean during the height of the Reconstruction era. We have to understand the stakes here.
What were the stakes?
Well, Haiti was the first, and at that time, only free black republic in the world.
Yep.
It held immense symbolic and strategic weight. For decades, the U.S. government had refused to even acknowledge Haiti's independence.
Why?
Because Southern slaveholders feared it would inspire uprisings at home.
Wow. So Bassett is basically the physical embodiment of America's shifting reality.
Precisely.
Right.
Bassett had to represent a United States who was deeply fractured, a government that many in his own community still deeply distrusted.
Of course.
While dealing with a foreign nation that had its own complex, highly defensive relationship with America.
So there was no playbook for him.
None. He couldn't rely on established protocol because the protocol had never accounted for a black man holding federal diplomatic power.
Wow.
He had to invent the mechanics of black diplomacy in real time.
And the archives draw a very deliberate lineage here, don't they?
They do.
They connect his solitary diplomatic survival to the massive geopolitical powerhouses of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Yes, the chain links him directly to figures like Ralph Bunche.
Oh.
Bunche would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for his incredibly complex mediation in the Middle East during the late 1940s.
Incredible.
And that lineage extends all the way to Colin Powell navigating global geopolitics as the first black Secretary of State.
That's a direct line.
It is. But that entire massive apparatus of institutional diplomacy, that whole lineage, Starts with Bassett alone in a room in 1869,
Just proving it was possible.
proving that intellectual and diplomatic endurance could weather the social extremes of the 19th century.
I love how we are seeing these solitary figures penetrating these ancient, rigid systems.
It's a pattern.
It is. But I have to admit, when I read the next note in our log, I actually stopped and reread it 3 times because the logistics of it just blow my mind.
Oh, the 1830 anchor.
Yes. We are moving from the U.S. federal government to an even older, more entrenched system. April 7th, 1830. The birth of James Augustine Healy.
Healy's story is a masterclass in what the sources call institutional navigation. He was born in Georgia, his father was an Irish planter, and his mother was an enslaved biracial woman.
Okay, so based on the laws back then...
Under the laws of Georgia at the time, Healy was legally enslaved from birth.
Right.
Yet, he would ultimately go on to become the first Black Roman Catholic bishop in the United States, eventually overseeing the Diocese of Portland, Maine.
Okay, wait. I have to push back on this, or at least ask for a serious mechanical explanation here.
I don't blame you.
We are talking about the hierarchy of the Catholic Church.
Yes.
This is one of the oldest, most rigid, most dogmatic institutions in the history of human civilization.
Absolutely.
And he is doing this during the absolute height of American race-based chattel slavery in the 1800s. Wait, navigating the hierarchy of the Catholic Church during the height of American racism? How is that even possible?
What's fascinating here is how Healy utilized the internal logic of the institution against the external logic of the society.
What do you mean by internal logic?
Well, the Catholic Church operates on a deeply entrenched, highly codified system of canon law, education, and sacramental authority. And in the eyes of the Church, that supersedes local civil law.
Interesting.
Healy's father essentially smuggled him and his siblings out of the South to the North to be educated in Quaker and eventually Catholic schools.
Wow, just got them out.
Yes. And Healy proved to be a brilliant theologian. He was actually ordained in Paris.
Oh, so he got European backing.
Exactly. When he returned to the U.S., he functioned within the Church's strict hierarchical meritocracy.
So it's almost like he was a localized operating system.
I hope so.
Think about it. The Catholic Church is this massive, ancient mainframe operating out of Rome, running on centuries of Latin protocols and dogma.
Right.
Healy has to take that 2,000-year-old operating system and translate it so it functions in 19th century America. He has to balance the rigid dictates of the Pope with the immediate, localized prejudices and needs of a congregation in Maine.
That is a very apt analogy.
He essentially forced the mainframe to recognize his administrative rights.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. The sources note that his ascension fundamentally challenged the spiritual monopoly of white supremacy within the oldest institutional religions in the West.
Because he was the boss.
He was the boss. In an era where Black people were systematically denied any form of legal, economic, or social agency, Healy held absolute spiritual and administrative authority over white priests and a white congregation.
That is wild.
When he gave an order in his diocese, it carried the weight of Rome.
Wow.
He proved that the institution, as massive as it was, could not remain a monolith. It could be rewired from the inside.
It's incredible. But as we look at the transition logic of our deep dive today, a stark reality sets in.
It does.
We've seen these solitary pioneers, Henson reading the ice, Bassett navigating the diplomatic crossfire, Healy rewiring the religious hierarchy.
They broke through.
They broke through these physical and social extremes, but breaking barriers, especially when you are the first and only one doing it, often exacts a devastating toll.
The cost is huge.
The blueprint shifts tone pretty dramatically right here.
It really does. The transition from the individual surviving the extreme to the individual being utterly consumed by it is a critical, unavoidable link in this historical chain.
Yeah.
Solitary pioneering often evolves into martyrdom. But what the sources reveal is how that martyrdom then transforms into a weapon.
It becomes a tool.
It transforms into inspiration, into art, and into the ultimate tool to mobilize the masses.
Right. And no one embodies the sheer geopolitical weight of martyrdom more starkly than our next anchor, April 7th, 1803.
The Black Napoleon.
Yes, the death of Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant tactical leader of the Haitian Revolution.
Such a tragic end.
According to the archives, he died in a freezing, damp, isolated prison cell at Fort de Joux in the Jura Mountains of France.
It is a bleak, tragic end for a man of his unparalleled genius. He was captured through deception, not on the battlefield.
Which makes it even worse.
It does. But this is where the historical butterfly effect becomes undeniable. Louverture died in that cold cell, isolated and starved. But the sources point out that his death solidified him as an immortal martyr of freedom.
It changed everything.
It crystallized the absolute resolve of the Haitian people. They realized there could be no negotiation with empire.
It was all or nothing.
Exactly. And because of that crystallized resolve, Haiti declared itself the first free black republic less than a year later in 1804.
I really want to impress the sheer geography of this upon you listening right now.
Good point.
Picture a global map. You have a man shivering in a freezing stone cell in the mountains of France. But the tactical genius he deployed before he was imprisoned, the revolution he set in motion on a small Caribbean island.
Yes.
The archives state that his actions directly forced the Louisiana Purchase.
It's incredible.
Explain the mechanics of that to us. How does a revolution in Haiti redraw the map of North America?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes down to the brutal economics of empire.
Okay, economics.
Napoleon Bonaparte had grand ambitions to build a massive French empire in the Americas, and the Louisiana Territory was meant to be the breadbasket for that empire.
Right, to feed the colonies.
But the economic engine, the crown jewel that funded Napoleon's military campaigns, was the colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti.
Because of the sugar.
Exactly. Incredibly lucrative sugar and coffee plantations fueled by enslaved labor.
So Haiti was essentially the ATM for the French Empire.
Exactly. It was the ATM. And Toussaint Louverture, through brilliant military strategy, dismantled that ATM.
Just smashed it.
The enslaved population overthrew the French forces. Napoleon sent massive fleets to retake the island, and Louverture's forces, along with yellow fever, decimated the French army.
Just wiped them out.
Because France permanently lost Haiti, Napoleon suddenly had no staging ground in the Caribbean, no massive influx of wealth, and impending war with Britain and Europe.
He was broke and panicking.
He could no longer defend or financially justify holding on to the massive, undeveloped Louisiana Territory in North America.
So he panicked and sold it to Thomas Jefferson.
He sold it for pennies on the dollar to fund his European wars.
Wow.
The result is that the physical map of the United States literally doubled in size overnight.
Just think about that.
The borders of the American nation we know today, the expansion into the West, were fundamentally triggered by a black revolutionary in the Caribbean who died in a French prison.
That is insane.
That is the ultimate, undeniable proof that solitary martyrdom echoes across continents and centuries. It completely reshaped global geopolitics.
It's the weaponization of a legacy.
Beautifully put.
Louverture's martyrdom mobilized an entire nation and altered the globe. But moving forward in our timeline into the 20th century, we see a different form of weaponization.
Yes, a cultural one.
We see vulnerability, pain, and marginalization being intentionally forged into art. And this brings us to two anchors born just days apart in our timeline.
This is a great pairing.
April 7th, 1915, the birth of Billie Holiday, and April 9th, 1898, the birth of Paul Robeson.
Two absolute titans of what the master synthesis document calls the artist-activist lineage.
Let's start with Holiday.
Let's look closely at Billie Holiday, born Eleanor Fagan. Lady Day, perhaps the most definitive and emotionally complex jazz vocalist of the 20th century. The archives specifically highlight the mechanics of her song Strange Fruit.
Right. Strange Fruit is widely considered the first major protest song of the civil rights era.
It is.
But what's fascinating is how the document describes it. It says she used jazz as a weapon. She transformed the raw, horrifying vulnerability of the Black American experience into high art.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a rally song. It wasn't designed to make you feel good or energized.
No, it was a dirge.
It was heavy.
Very heavy. It was a haunting, slow, agonizing confrontation. When she sang about the lynchings in the American South, the strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees, she utilized silence, lighting, and pacing.
She controlled the room.
She forced the audience, often predominantly white audiences in upscale clubs, to look directly at the horrific violence they were either complicit in or actively ignoring.
How did she do that physically?
She would have all the lights in the club turned off, except for a single spotlight on her face. Waiters were forbidden from serving drinks during the song.
Wow. She controlled the physical environment to force psychological complicity. That is brilliant.
It was revolutionary.
You couldn't just tap your foot and ignore the message. She held people hostage to the truth.
Exactly.
The sources trace her direct influence all the way from Nina Simone to modern artists like Erykah Badu. She proved that art isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror that society cannot look away from.
And Paul Robeson took that mirror and magnified it so the entire globe had to look into it.
Tell us about Robeson.
Born in Princeton, New Jersey, Robeson was an extraordinary polymath. We are talking about a man who was an all-American athlete, a brilliant scholar who graduated valedictorian of Rutgers, an incredibly successful stage and film actor, and a bass baritone singer with a voice that practically shook the earth.
Just good at everything.
Literally everything. But the logs emphasize something specific, how he weaponized that massive international fame.
Right.
He didn't just sing for applause. He fought for the rights of workers and colonized people worldwide.
I always found this part of Robeson's life so compelling. He didn't just sing spirituals.
No.
He was out there singing anthems for Welsh coal miners who were striking. He was singing for anti-fascist fighters in the Spanish Civil War.
His reach was global.
He had this completely global empathy. He created a unified theory of labor, class, and race. He essentially told the world the oppression of a black man in Mississippi is structurally identical to the oppression of a coal miner in Wales.
He identified the global systems of oppression. And for that exact reason, for refusing to separate his global art from his radical anti-imperialist activism, he was deemed a massive threat by the United States government during the Cold War.
Because he was uniting people.
Exactly. They blacklisted him. They literally revoked his passport so he couldn't travel and spread his message.
That's devastating.
They tried to erase him from the public consciousness.
Which proves just how terrified the institution was of a single voice.
It really does.
The sources name him the original artist activist, paving a lineage that flows through figures like Harry Belafonte, right down to modern artists like Kendrick Lamar today.
Yes, artists who understand the assignment.
Artists who understand that their platform isn't just a stage, it's a structural tool for liberation.
It perfectly illustrates how art bypasses the logical defensive brain and hits people right in the emotional core.
It sneaks past the defenses.
It claims psychological territory, which leads us to one of the most visually and symbolically powerful moments in this entire historical log.
Oh, where art claimed physical territory.
Actual physical territory. April 9th, 1939, Marian Anderson at the Lincoln Memorial.
I've seen the iconic photos of Marian Anderson standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial, singing into those old school microphones.
They're legendary photos.
They are. But I always assumed, before reading this deep dive, that it was a standard government-invited concert. It looks so official, but it wasn't, was it?
Not at all. The origins of this event are rooted in blatant institutional exclusion.
Really?
Marian Anderson was an incredibly famous, globally recognized operatic contralto. She was scheduled to perform in Washington, D.C., but she was explicitly barred from performing at Constitution Hall by the Daughters of the American Revolution purely because of her race.
Just purely because of her race.
Constitution Hall was the premier indoor venue in the Capitol, and the institution shut its doors to her.
So what does she do? She doesn't just issue a statement and go home.
No, she doesn't.
With the help of Eleanor Roosevelt, who actually resigned from the Durar in protest, and other officials, Anderson pivots the entire paradigm.
A massive pivot.
She takes the exclusion and turns it into an unparalleled spectacle. She sets up a microphone outside, right in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and she sings, "My country 'tis of thee," for a crowd of 75,000 people. 75,000.
The spatial and logistical significance of this cannot be overstated.
Tell me more about that.
Before 1939, the Lincoln Memorial was largely a static monument. It was a quiet place of reflection. The archives argue that this singular performance fundamentally transformed the Lincoln Memorial from a passive statue into a living, sacred site for civil rights protest.
She completely changed the meaning of this space.
She redefined what that physical space meant for the entire country.
She effectively rezoned the National Mall.
Exactly. And the extrapolation the blueprint makes here is profound. This specific event in 1939 directly inspired the logistics, the physical location, and the symbolic framing of the 1963 March on Washington, where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver his I Have a Dream speech.
Wow. So when we picture the March on Washington, that iconic sea of people stretching all the way down the reflecting pool.
Which is burned into our minds.
Right, which is basically the visual definition of the civil rights movement in the American consciousness. We are actually looking at a logistical echo of Marian Anderson standing there 24 years earlier.
It's a direct echo.
She drew the blueprint for how to use that exact space to confront the government.
Precisely. It is art claiming physical space and demanding institutional recognition. But art also claims cultural and psychological space.
Oh, definitely.
To understand the global dimension of that, we look at our next anchor across the Atlantic. April 6, 1935, the birth of J.P. Clark in Nigeria.
J.P. Clark Beckadermo, a renowned Nigerian poet and playwright. The notes mention he was a key driving figure in something called the Mbari Club of African Writers.
Yes.
What exactly was the Mbari Club, and why is it an anchor in this timeline?
The Mbari Club was a crucial intellectual and cultural hub, founded in Nigeria in the early 1960s, right around the time of Nigerian independence.
A time of huge transition.
Huge transition. It brought together writers, artists, and musicians, titans like Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka.
Legends.
Clark's work, according to the sources, specifically explored the deep, agonizing tension between traditional Aisho culture and Western modernity. He was instrumental in creating what is often referred to as the Nigerian Renaissance.
I want you, the listener, to think about this dynamic for a second because it is so incredibly relatable.
It really is.
Think about the tension in your own life between the traditions of your family, the way your parents or grandparents did things, the old country, the old neighborhood.
Right, those deep roots.
And then contrast that with the fast-paced, highly digitized, Western-dominated modern world you live in now.
It's a constant pull.
It's a universal feeling of being pulled in two completely different directions, feeling like you belong to both and neither at the exact same time.
Yeah.
J.P. Clark captured that exact intimate tension, but he did it on a massive national scale for a post-colonial Nigeria trying to figure out its own identity.
And in doing so, he proved that the African pen was as sharp, as nuanced, and as capable of dissecting the modern human condition as any Western literary tool.
Which was huge back then.
Because under colonialism, the narrative was that African culture was primitive, that it needed Western institutions to civilize it.
Right.
Clark and the Mbari Club claimed the intellectual and cultural sovereignty of their people through literature. They built a sovereign institution of the mind.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though, because art, literature, poetry, these are profound ways to claim sovereignty.
Absolutely.
But sometimes undeniable excellence in a completely different, highly commercialized arena becomes its own form of irrefutable protest.
Oh, yes.
Which takes us to April 8th, 1974, Henry Hank Aaron of the Atlanta Braves.
A legendary moment in sports history. On this day, Hank Aaron hit his 715th home run, breaking Babe Ruth's long-standing, almost mythic, deeply protected record.
But the context is everything here.
It is.
He didn't just break a record on a sunny afternoon while everyone cheered. The logs highlight the sheer, terrifying hostility of the environment he was operating in.
The vitriol was insane.
He achieved this while receiving an avalanche of death threats, hate mail, and racist vitriol. People were threatening his life, threatening to kidnap his family, simply because a black man was about to mathematically surpass the ultimate white American sports hero.
It brings us back to the hostility of the environments these pioneers had to survive.
And how did he respond?
That's the best part.
The sources frame it perfectly. He turned a sports milestone into a victory for black dignity. His bat, famously called his hammer, became a symbol of steady, quiet excellence in the face of violently loud opposition.
I think the deeper insight here is about how undeniable data acts as a weapon against subjective prejudice.
Say more about that.
You can argue with a protest song, you can debate a poem, you can burn a cross on someone's lawn, but you cannot argue with a 715th home run.
It's just a fact.
You cannot unhit the ball. The math is irrefutable.
Wow. Data as armor.
Aaron didn't need to engage with the vitriol or shout back at the crowds. He simply stepped up to the plate and generated data that proved he was better than anyone else in history. It's the ultimate mic drop.
That is a fascinating conceptual angle. And that quiet, data-driven excellence, that absolute dignity, mobilizes people just as surely as a political rally.
It really does.
It builds the psychological foundation required for a community to believe that they deserve a seat at the table, which prepares us for the next highly volatile phase of our blueprint.
The political phase.
Exactly. Because art, literature, sports, they inspire, they mobilize, they shift the culture. But if you want sweeping, permanent, structural change, eventually you have to confront the law.
You have to change the
You have to step out of the baseball diamond and into the courtroom. You have to confront the state apparatus itself. This brings us to part 3 of our deep dive, the bloody road to institutional democracy.
This is a heavy section.
It is. Now, before we step into this next section, I need to take a brief, formal moment to speak directly to you, our listener. As we move into this specific part of the historical arc, we are going to be discussing highly politically charged historical events.
Right.
These events involve both left-wing and right-wing actors, governments, assassinations, and massive political upheavals. I want to be explicitly clear. As your hosts, we are impartially reporting the factual contents of the original source text we've been provided by the researchers.
And sticking to the facts provided.
We are not taking sides, we are not endorsing any specific political ideologies, and we are not making modern political statements. Our job here is simply to convey the ideas, the mechanics, and the historical chain of events exactly as they are laid out in the archival material before us.
It is a necessary and important distinction to make. History, particularly legal and political history, is incredibly complex and often violent.
Yeah, very violent.
Our goal is structural synthesis, not political endorsement. And the legal history we are about to examine is certainly complex, beginning with a monumental legislative clash on April 9, 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866.
This one is structurally fascinating. According to the archives, the 39th U.S. Congress passed this act, which declared that all persons born in the United States, excluding Native Americans at the time, notably, were to be considered citizens,
regardless of race or previous condition of slavery.
But President Andrew Johnson, who took over after Lincoln was assassinated, vetoed it.
He did. President Johnson was a Southern Democrat who was deeply opposed to extending citizenship, voting rights, and legal protections to formerly enslaved people.
He wanted to pump the brakes.
He wanted a rapid, lenient reconciliation with the South that largely ignored the rights of Black Americans. So he vetoed the bill, essentially telling Congress that he would not allow the federal government to enforce civil rights.
But what the sources highlight is the mechanism of what happened next. Congress overrode his veto.
Which is not easy.
Explain the mechanics of a veto override for us, because it's not just a simple revote. It requires a massive consensus, right?
Exactly. To override a presidential veto in the United States, you need a two-thirds supermajority in both the House of Representatives and the Senate.
That's a huge hurdle.
It is incredibly difficult to achieve. It requires overwhelming political unity. The archives explicitly state that this was the very first time in United States history that a major piece of legislation became law over a presidential veto.
So Congress essentially went to war with the president to secure civil rights.
They did. The radical Republicans in Congress flexed their institutional muscle against the executive branch. It was a constitutional showdown.
A huge one.
And the blueprint identifies this 1866 act as the direct legal ancestor of the 14th Amendment, which was passed shortly after to solidify these rights in the Constitution itself.
So this is where it all started.
This act is the bedrock of all modern birthright citizenship laws in the United States. Without this specific legislative rebellion, the concept that being born on American soil makes you an American citizen might not exist today. It was the first structural, legal brick in the wall of equality.
It is the machinery of the law literally forcing the country to live up to its own rhetoric.
Yes.
But when we look across the world, we see that confronting the state isn't always done in a wood-paneled legislative chamber with gavels and voting procedure.
Unfortunately not.
Sometimes it happens in the streets, and it comes with a devastating, bloody cost. This brings us to a crucial South African through line in our sources, starting on April 5th, 1916, with the birth of A.P.M. of Day.
Ashby Peter Salamzi Mtee, a brilliant South African teacher, lawyer, and political intellect.
The archives identify him as the co-founder of the African National Congress Youth League,
the ANC Youth League,
and a pivotal ideological architect of a philosophy known as Africanism.
That word architect keeps popping up everywhere in this document.
It really does. Mgudu wasn't just a participant holding a sign at a protest. He was designing the foundational ideology of the resistance.
He was.
The notes say he mentored leaders like Robert Sobukwe and a young Nelson Mandela, and that he was responsible for fundamentally shifting the ANC's strategy. How did he shift it?
Well, prior to Mgudu and the Youth League, the ANC often operated through polite petitions.
Letters and stuff.
Formal delegations, appeals to the moral conscience of the white minority government.
Hoping they would just do the right thing.
Right. And Mgudu recognized that this was completely failing. The apartheid state was not going to be convinced by polite letters.
Obviously not.
His philosophy of Africanism centered on African agency, the idea that liberation had to be driven by the active, forceful, unapologetic mobilization of the black majority.
Action over words.
He shifted the ANC from a polite debating society into a militant, mass action movement involving boycotts, strikes, and civil disobedience. He built the intellectual framework for confronting the state head-on.
But the cost of that direct confrontation as the decades rolled on was incredibly high.
So high.
Which leads us to the terrifying climax of that South African timeline in our log. April 10th, 1993, the assassination of Chris Hani.
Chris Hani was a massively influential figure. He was the leader of the South African Communist Party and the chief of staff of Umkhonto we Sizwe.
Which was the armed wing, right?
Yes, the armed militant wing of the ANC. He was immensely popular, especially among the radicalized youth in the townships.
People loved him.
They really did. And on April 10th, 1993, he was murdered in the driveway of his home by a Polish far-right immigrant who was part of a conspiracy to derail the peaceful transition of power.
When I read this part of the synthesis, the tension described is just unbelievable.
It's palpable.
The sources note that this assassination nearly plunged South Africa into an all-out apocalyptic racial civil war. The country was balancing on a razor's edge.
It really was.
Yeah. The white far-right wanted to provoke the black majority into a violent uprising so the military could step in and crush them, effectively ending the negotiations to end apartheid.
It was arguably the most volatile moment in South Africa's 20th century history. Nelson Mandela, who wasn't even president yet, had to go on national television and appeal for calm.
You had to step up.
Acting as the de facto head of state to prevent the country from burning to the ground. But this raises an incredibly important point about martyrdom acting as an institutional pressure point.
How so?
The synthesis document states that the sheer terror of what almost happened, the realization of how close they came to utter annihilation, forced the hand of the apartheid government.
So the assassination was the absolute breaking point. It broke the deadlock.
Yes. In the aftermath of Hani's death, the apartheid government realized they could no longer delay. They were forced to finally set a definitive, binding date for the 1994 democratic elections. Hani is described in our blueprint as the soldier statesman. His sacrifice represents the ultimate bloody price that was paid to ensure the birth of the modern democratic rainbow nation.
His death forced the issue.
The pressure generated by his death made the continuation of apartheid practically and politically impossible.
That pressure was domestic, obviously, boiling up from the streets. But our sources also highlight how global institutional pressure was squeezing the apartheid state from the outside.
Right, from the international community.
If we go back slightly in time to April 5th, 1961, the first UK anti-apartheid vote.
This is a critical diplomatic anchor. On this day in 1961, the United Kingdom government officially supported a United Nations General Assembly resolution condemning apartheid for the very first time.
Why is that specific vote so important in the grand scheme of things? I mean, the UN passes resolutions all the time. Why does Britain condemning it in 1961 matter so much?
If we connect this to the bigger geopolitical picture, you have to understand Britain's relationship with South Africa. South Africa was a former British colony, a member of the Commonwealth, and Britain had deep, massive historical and economic ties there.
They were closely linked.
Very. For a long time, Britain abstained from condemning South Africa, treating apartheid as an internal domestic issue.
Just looking the other way.
By officially voting to condemn the regime at the UN, Britain signaled a major shift in the global tolerance of racial politics.
So Britain basically signaled to the rest of the world that South Africa was officially toxic.
Exactly. The sources state that this diplomatic pivot was the crack in the dam. It legitimized international interference and opened the floodgates for the massive global sanctions movements.
The boycotts.
The cultural boycotts and the financial divestments that eventually crippled the apartheid economy in the 1980s. It was the international community institutionalizing its disapproval.
It's like the walls were closing in on the apartheid regime from absolutely every angle.
From inside and outside.
Right. From Estada's youth league designing the philosophy in the townships, to Hani's ultimate sacrifice forcing the election date, to the halls of the United Nations cutting off their international legitimacy.
A coordinated structural squeeze.
And speaking of the UN, that global stage eventually welcomed a leader who completely embodies this arc of institutional power. April 8th, 1938, the birth of Kofi Annan.
Born in Kumasi in the Gold Coast, which is now modern-day Ghana, Kofi Annan would go on to become the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations.
That's a huge leap.
It is. What's structurally notable about Anna is that he was the first Secretary General to rise directly through the UN staff ranks.
Oh, he wasn't an outsider?
No, he wasn't a politician appointed from the outside. He was a career diplomat who intimately understood the complex bureaucratic mechanics of the institution from the inside out.
The notes call him the face of global African leadership at the turn of the millennium. But more importantly, he left behind a massive doctrinal legacy that changed how international law works.
A huge legacy.
Can you explain the mechanics of his big doctrine?
Yes, the responsibility to protect doctrine, universally abbreviated as R2P.
R2P, right.
To understand how revolutionary this is, you have to understand the centuries-old Westphalian concept of national sovereignty.
Give us the quick version of that.
Traditionally, international law dictated that whatever a government did within its own borders to its own people was its own business. Sovereignty was absolute. No one could interfere.
The ultimate mind-your-own-business clause of global politics.
Precisely. But following the horrifying genocides in Rwanda and the mass atrocities in the Balkans in the 1990s, Annan argued that this absolute sovereignty was a shield from murderers.
He called it out.
He championed the R2P framework. It legally altered the concept of sovereignty. It essentially states that sovereignty is not an absolute right, it is a responsibility.
A responsibility to your citizens.
If a state fails to protect its own populations from mass atrocity crimes, genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or if the state is the one committing them, then that state forfeits its sovereignty. And the international community has the legal right and responsibility to intervene.
That is a complete paradigm shift. We have literally gone from Toussaint Louverture dying in a damp cell, fighting an empire just for his basic right to exist as a human being,
To the very top.
to Kofi Annan sitting at the head of the largest global institution in the world, literally rewriting the international legal codes on how sovereign states are required to protect their people.
That is the complete arc. From fighting the institution just to survive, to leading the institution and rewriting the laws of humanity.
It's beautiful.
It brings us beautifully to the final culminating phase of our blueprint.
Right, because once you survive the extremes, once you weaponize your art, and once you dismantle the old oppressive political structures, the obvious lingering question is, what do you build in their place?
You have to build something new.
How do you secure your future so you never have to go back to the ice? And this is where we arrive at the final destination of our weekly arc synthesis. This is part 4, brick by brick, economic, spiritual, and academic sovereignty. This is the forging of the iron-clad sovereign institutions.
If the previous anchors were about breaking ground, surviving the elements, and clearing away the debris of the old world, these final anchors are about pouring the concrete.
Pouring the concrete, I like that.
And it all starts with the foundation of spiritual and economic autonomy. April 10th, 1816. Richard Allen.
Richard Allen, an incredible figure. On this day, he was formally consecrated as the very first bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, widely known as the AME Church.
This is a monumental structural achievement.
Yeah.
The AME Church was the first fully independent black denomination in the United States,
It's the very first.
born out of a protest against racial segregation within the Methodist Church in Philadelphia. But as our notes heavily emphasize, we cannot view this purely through a theological lens.
Right.
This was never just about religion.
That's a vital point. I was reading this section on the economics of this, and it really clicked for me. If you were a black person in 1816 America, there was no governmental safety net.
None at all.
The modern welfare state, Social Security, Medicare, none of that existed. And even if it did, you would be excluded from it. Banks weren't giving you loans to buy a house.
Schools are closed to you.
White schools weren't opening their doors to educate your children. Hospitals wouldn't treat you. The community was entirely on its own.
Completely isolated.
So the church had to become all of those things. It wasn't just a place to pray on Sunday. It was the bank, the community center, the school, the political forum, and the sanctuary, all rolled into one physical building.
Exactly. It was a sovereign, economic, and social institution built by and for the community, totally independent of white oversight or funding.
That independence is key.
And the synthesis document draws a brilliant direct chain link here. It states that the AME Church and the network of black churches it inspired would go on to be the engine room of the 20th century civil rights movement.
That makes perfect sense. Where do they hold the mass meetings for the Montgomery bus boycott?
In the churches?
Yes. The organizing, the secret funding, the physical meeting spaces where leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. planned their strategies.
That all happened within the church spaces.
The physical, economic, and structural safety of the spaces pioneered by Richard Allen in 1816. You cannot have a civil rights movement without a physical building to meet in that the oppressor doesn't own.
built in 1816, powering a massive political movement a century and a half later. That is the very definition of structural permanence.
It really is.
And speaking of building economic structures for the future, we have to look at a deeply misunderstood anchor from April 5th, 1856, the birth of Booker T. Washington.
Born into slavery in Virginia, Booker T. Washington would go on to become the founding principal of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama.
A huge figure.
The notes describe his birth as the beginning of the Tuskegee machine, a massively influential global model for industrial education and Black self-reliance.
Right.
Now, hold on. I have to jump in here because when you hear Booker T. Washington's name today, the historical narrative is often heavily critical of him.
Yes, it is.
He is frequently remembered almost exclusively for his pragmatism, specifically his Atlanta Compromise speech. The common narrative is that he told Black Americans to focus solely on industrial labor, farming, and vocational skills, and to completely abandon political agitation or the fight for civil rights in exchange for basic economic survival. Isn't that the standard view?
It is the standard view, but as our sources illuminate, it is a vastly incomplete and somewhat deceptive one.
Okay, lay it on me.
The archives reveal a layer of strategic brilliance that is often ignored. Yes, publicly, he was advocating for economic self-reliance, vocational training, and appeasing white Southern anxiety. He was projecting a non-threatening image.
The public face.
But the documents reveal that Washington balanced this public pragmatism with secret, clandestine funding for civil rights litigation.
Wait, really? Secret funding?
Yeah.
So he was publicly telling people to keep their heads down while privately writing checks to lawyers to fight the system. That is wild.
It was a matter of institutional survival. He understood that overt, loud political agitation in the Deep South during the height of Jim Crow could result in the literal, physical destruction of the institutions he was trying to build.
They would have burned it down.
If he was deemed a radical, white mobs would have burned Tuskegee to the ground. So he built the economic engine, publicly garnering massive donations from wealthy white northern industrialists like Andrew Carnegie.
Taking their money.
And privately, quietly, funneled those resources into fighting disenfranchisement, segregation, and peonage laws in the courts.
He was playing chess on two completely different boards at the exact same time.
Brilliant, really.
The Public Board of Economic Appeasement and the Private Board of Legal Warfare. And the blueprint notes that his overarching philosophy of economic independence laid the vital groundwork for the later Buy Black movements and the explosion of modern Black entrepreneurship.
He laid the foundation.
He was building an economic fortress that could sustain the community long after he was gone.
And he wasn't the only one building fortresses to secure the future. April 11th, 1881 brings us the incredible story of Sophia B. Packard and Harriet E. Giles.
Two visionary educators who traveled to Atlanta to open the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary. And I love the logistical reality of this. Where did they open this grand institution of higher learning?
Where?
In a damp, dark church basement.
Literally, starting from the underground.
Literally.
And that institution, born in a basement with just 11 students, would eventually secure funding notably from John D. Rockefeller, whose wife's maiden name was Spelman.
Oh, wow.
And it would become Spelman College.
The premier institution for the higher education of Black women in the world.
The sources are absolutely definitive on its impact. Spelman produced what the synthesis document calls the vanguard of Black female leadership.
The vanguard.
It provided a protected, rigorous academic environment where Black women were the center of the intellectual universe, not marginalized participants.
The chain of leadership that comes out of that basement is staggering to think about. You have Pulitzer Prize-winning authors like Alice Walker.
Marion Wright Edelman.
Yes, founding the Children's Defense Fund, all the way to modern political powerhouses and voting rights architects like Stacey Abrams.
It's an incredible lineage.
They were educated, nurtured, and forged in an institution that was created explicitly for their excellence. That is academic sovereignty.
But our blueprint also highlights a completely different form of academic and scientific sovereignty.
What's that?
What the synthesis document hauntingly refers to as the invisible labs. Let's look at April 11th, 1899, the birth of Percy Julian, and pair it directly with an event much later, on April 8th, 1990.
Percy Julian, a pioneering research chemist. I want to spend a minute explaining the mechanics of what he actually did because it's brilliant.
It is.
The notes say he discovered how to synthesize cortisone and other steroids from plants. Now, cortisone is a hormone used to treat severe inflammation, rheumatoid arthritis, all sorts of ailments.
It's essential medicine.
Before Julian, getting these steroids meant extracting them from the bile of slaughtered animals. It took thousands of animal carcasses to produce a few drops of medicine.
Very inefficient.
It was insanely expensive, meaning only the ultra-wealthy could afford relief from arthritis. Julian comes along, looks at the chemical structure, and figures out how to synthesize these exact same steroid rings from cheap, abundant plant sources like soybeans and Mexican yams.
He changed everything.
He democratized medicine. He held over 130 patents.
130 patents. And his process is described in the archives as the direct functional ancestor of modern green chemistry and sustainable pharmacology. He proved that black scientific brilliance could literally alleviate the physical pain of the entire globe.
Oh,
But we have to remember the context of his era.
right.
He was operating during the peak of Jim Crow. Despite having a PhD from the University of Vienna, despite his undeniable genius, he was repeatedly denied academic appointments and leadership roles at major universities and corporations strictly because of his race.
So if the established academic institutions wouldn't let him in the door, he had to build his own spaces. The invisible labs. He built his own chemical companies.
Yes. He achieved massive commercial success, entirely outside the traditional white-dominated academic structures. But this brings us to the crucial 1990 date.
What happened then?
On April 8, 1990, Percy Julian, along with the legendary agricultural scientist George Washington Carver, became the first African-American inventors inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame.
1990. I read that and it just felt absurdly late. We are talking about guys doing their defining work in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s.
It was incredibly egregiously late. The sources call it a long overdue institutional recognition.
I'll say.
But the chain link here is vital for our blueprint.
Yeah.
This 1990 induction finally validated those invisible labs of the Jim Crow era. It placed their genius permanently and officially into the national institutional memory.
Which is so important.
Why does that matter? Because it serves as a beacon for a whole new generation of black STEM leaders. It structurally confirms that their contributions are foundational to American science.
It's about securing your permanent place in the historical record. You can't be erased once you are carved into the walls of the Hall of Fame.
Exactly.
Which leads us to the final two anchors of our entire deep dive. Two massive, modern institutional pillars that secure both physical space and global economic dominance. April 11th, 1968, and April 10th, 1957.
Let's start with the legal pillar in 1968. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is most commonly known as the Fair Housing Act.
The historical context of this signing is intense.
Very intense.
The notes mention this was signed just days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., while massive riots were tearing through American cities.
It was a turbulent time.
It essentially marks the final major legislative victory of what the sources call the classic civil rights era. But let's look at the mechanics of what this law actually did.
Its purpose was profound and deeply structural. The Fair Housing Act officially prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex.
Before this act, things were very different.
Practices like redlining, where banks would literally draw red lines on maps around black neighborhoods and refuse to invest or give mortgages there.
Just legally cutting them off.
And restrictive covenants, which legally barred homeowners from selling to black buyers, were completely legal and standard practice.
Which means you could work hard, save your money, but still be completely legally barred from moving into a neighborhood with good schools, clean air, and appreciating property values. You were legally trapped.
Exactly. This law became, and remains today, the primary institutional tool for fighting residential segregation. It is fundamentally about the legal right to secure physical space and property.
And property is everything.
And as we know, in a capitalist system, homeownership is the primary engine for generational wealth transfer.
Securing physical space is the absolute prerequisite for building wealth. Which brings us beautifully to the final anchor. The birth of Aliko Dangote on April 10th, 1957, in Kano, Nigeria.
Aliko Dangote is a Nigerian industrialist, the founder of the Dangote Group, and he became the wealthiest person on the African continent.
What billionaire?
But the synthesis document doesn't just focus on his bank account. It points out that his massive rise in the cement, sugar, and manufacturing industries shifted the entire global narrative of the African continent.
How so?
For decades, the Western narrative of Africa was purely a narrative of aid and extraction. Africa was viewed as a place you take raw materials from or a place you send charity to.
The old colonial view.
Exactly. Dangote represents a shift to a narrative of industry and internal production. His companies manufacture the literal cement that is building the infrastructure of modern Africa. It is intra-African trade. It is value being created and retained within the continent.
So what does this all mean when we put the final pieces together? When we look at the Fair Housing Act of '68 and the rise of a billionaire industrialist like Dangote?
It means we are looking at the final, realized pieces of the architect's blueprint.
The finished product.
The 1968 Act provided the legal sovereignty to secure physical neighborhoods, homes, and generational wealth in the American diaspora. Meanwhile, Dangote represents what the sources call black gold, true economic sovereignty driven by a massive industrialization.
He owns the means of production.
He isn't asking for a seat at the global economic table. He owns the factory that manufactures the table.
That's a great way to put it.
I really want to ask you, the listener, to pause and reflect on this. What stands out to you when you look at this incredible transition?
It's a lot to take in.
When you trace the line from Matthew Henson, a solitary man freezing in the Arctic ice just trying to survive the elements, to a billionaire reshaping global industry through massive cement factories and logistics networks.
It's breathtaking, honestly, just zooming out and looking at this incredible journey drawn entirely from this one stack of notes we were given today.
You have quite an arc.
We started in the absolute physical extremes with Matthew Henson at the North Pole and Ebenezer Bassett surviving the diplomatic freeze. We moved through the deep vulnerability and the weaponized art of Billie Holiday and Paul Robeson forcing the world to look in the mirror.
Yes.
We witnessed the bloody, unyielding political pressure of Chris Hani and the Youth League forcing the hand of apartheid. And we finally arrived at the iron-clad, undeniable institutions of Spelman College, the AME Church, the United Nations doctrines, and global industrial entrepreneurship.
Brick by brick, from digging in the frozen mud to dominating the skyline, the blueprint was followed.
Exactly. The foundation was laid in isolation and the sovereign skyscraper was built. But I want to leave you, our listener, with a final lingering thought to mull over as we wrap up.
What's that?
We've seen how the historical architects of the past used the specific tools of their eras to build power. They used church basements, they used green chemistry in invisible labs, they used legal defiance to override presidential vetoes, and they used jazz songs to force complicity. They built physical and institutional sovereignty.
He used what they had?
So my question for you is this. What will the digital or technological equivalent of the sovereign institution look like for the next generation of the diaspora?
That's the real question.
When the most valuable territory isn't just physical land or cement, but artificial intelligence, data ownership, and algorithms, who are the new solitary pioneers stepping out into that hostile, uncharted digital environment to build the next foundation?
That is the new frontier. They are out there mapping the code and the algorithms right now, just like Henson mapped the ice.
And I absolutely cannot wait to see what kind of institutions they build. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep questioning the narratives you were handed, keep learning the hidden mechanics of history, and keep connecting the dots.
Thanks for listening.
Remember, next time you look up at a massive, unshakable institution, take a second to think about the solitary pioneer who had to stand freezing in the mud to dig the foundation. Catch you next time.